Now, I won't say much about this in relation this evening, although it might be something that we want to talk more about. But there is a very interesting kind of physical geography to this network. And in particular, there's a global distribution of the creative expertise that goes into the building of these large-scale development projects. So, as we found out in our project in the Gulf, there's a book recently by a scholar, Ren, who's looked at similarly large development projects and kind of big landmark buildings in China. Donald McNeill is a geographer who's looked at this. The creative expertise that designs these projects, the architects and the visualisers and the master planners, are all in the global north. And there's a very particular urban geography of where these architects and visualisers are. All the architects working on this project in downtown Doha are in London, every single one. And all the visualisers are a little more scattered. There's been one in Portugal, they've used a couple of US firms, there's one in Liverpool, but it's all cities in the US or Western Europe. But of course, the money and the kind of cultural agenda is in the Gulf, and in particular with the Sheikha and her really, I think, in some ways, quite challenging cultural agenda that she doesn't want just to import, Koolhaas and Nouvelle and Foster and Sterling. And just build these big star architecture one-off buildings, as has happened elsewhere in the Gulf. What she wants is these London architects to understand what a Qatari architecture might look like. So there's a lot of, I think, often quite difficult negotiation that's gone on around that, which I think is really interesting. Of course, not least because Qatar actually doesn't have a very long urban tradition. The oldest building in Doha is actually a Turkish fort. And to the extent that there is a kind of 20th century urban tradition, it was shaped in large part by British planners who, some of which designed Milton Keynes, which is my university town. They came over to Doha post-Second World War and offered a master plan for the city there. So the whole idea of kind of cultural identity is incredibly complex in this project and very interesting, and has this kind of global geography of where cultural creativity and identities are being articulated. So that's the first sort of network that Law talks about, and the one that's shaping our study is the actual physical places where these things are made and where they circulate. The second sort of network space, though, that's identified by Law is one that I'm going to talk rather more about, and it's enacted not by the visualisations mobility so much, but by the work that's done to create and maintain them. And here I want to use a quote from Bruno Latour. His definition of this sort of a network, which is the work that takes any substance that had seemed at first self-contained and transforms it into what it needs to subsist through a complex ecology of allies, accomplices, and helpers. And I guess post hoc, our methodology for this project has been to focus not on the images so much. I've not done a kind of semiological reading of these images. What we've done is a sort of ethnography, of the allies, accomplices, and helpers that have created and have worked with these images in different ways. So these images aren't self-contained. They're not like photographs or paintings that the architects and marketing people might once have used to show a new early development project. They're mobile, and for me, importantly, they change as they move through different places, through this network of allies, accomplices, and helpers. And that mutability, the changeability of these images is really a crucial characteristic of this particular understanding of their digitalness and of the networks that they move through. They're constantly changing, not only because as they get worked on in different places, they participate in different ecologies of allies and helpers, which are different sorts of architects, designers, but also printers, projectors. We're already seeing here we've got a different visualisation given the the colour quality of this particular projector, billboards, books, real estate fairs and so on. They also change because that's how they're made, and because their modifiability, I think, is actually one of the key attractions to them, to property developers. They can exist in many, many different versions, and you can change them, actually, if you've got money and the time, fairly easily. So just to give you a sense of what I mean, here's one version of one of the shopping centres that's going to be in this development project, but here's another. And here's another. This is kind of spot the difference pictures. Oh, sorry, I need to do that. I was going to flip back to the, so let me run through again. So some subtle differences, changes of lighting, of mood, and other, whole bits of the building, that canopy can just be taken away, and you can have a look at it. So this constant changeability, I think, is really crucial. And I want to move on and think a bit about why that matters, and why I think it motivates the development companies and certainly the visualisers to be very invested in these images and make extensive use of them. So what happens then when these images begin to circulate? Now, they get changed, I've already said that. What I also just want to talk a little bit about, I want to pick out particular moments of their change, their changeability. But I also want to think about the ways in which, despite their very glossy, beautiful surface finish, there's actually a lot of kind of friction that goes on in this modifiability. Because on the one hand, it's so easy, you just flicker, well, if you know how to use that very complicated visualization software, you just change a couple of menus and the image changes from being a nighttime to a daytime image, and it's incredibly easy. On the other hand, actually, there's an awful lot of kind of complication and difficulty that also goes on as these images travel and circulate. So I just want to try and pick up on a few examples of that. And the first example, what I also want to try and begin to suggest is that these examples of the particular way in which these images are digital actually has wider applicability, not just to this sort of image, but perhaps to digital images more generally, and how we're beginning to use them in so many aspects of our lives. The first aspect I'm going to talk a little bit about is the way in which all the people we spoke to were very aware that when they changed an image, it was because they wanted to achieve something with it in relation to a particular context and often a particular audience. So they were very conscious when they changed the image of the audience that this image would have and the kind of impact they wanted to have on that audience. So as one of the architects we talked to said, he said it's always the question for these images: who's it for and what stage are you at? Now, this awareness of the audience of the image has been focused on by Kress, who's actually an education theorist, but he's very interested in how students now learn in classrooms using all sorts of different media. And he's argued that if you, one of the really significant ways in which digital communication is different from other forms, this is his argument, we can discuss it, is that, as he says, every event of communication is in principle unpredictable in its form, its structure, and its unfolding. Because you never really know, if you post something up on Facebook, you can never quite be sure who's going to look at it, what they're going to do with it. So he's saying this absence of a secure frame of interpretation requires each participant in interaction they assess on each occasion the social environment, the social relations which obtain within it, and the resources available for shaping the communication or encounter. And just to run with the Facebook example, of course, there's been a lot of cultural studies work that suggests that actually young people in particular are very clear about this. They manage their Facebook presence actually very carefully, precisely thinking about who it is that's going to be looking at it, what image they want to convey, and so on. Now, this awareness of what image is being conveyed and what impact it's supposed to have on different audiences is absolutely central to how these digital visualizations are changed in this design process. So as a visualizer said to us, you can change digital content a lot change a physical thing. And you can tell multiple different stories with different options depending on who you're talking to. So he has absolutely this view, there's no secure frame, that he is tailoring every image to a particular circumstance. So, for example, that means that so that whole interesting kind of magic and atmosphere has been very important for the architect and the architectural language advisor in terms of pitching this whole development project to the client, to Her Highness. But the marketeers actually have a rather different view about magic. They want something actually really quite specific, and we were told that, for example, to sell an office block in this development, what was needed actually were 4 shots, 4 visualisations. It was of the main entrance, the lobby, a shot from a kind of average office showing the nice view, showing the atmosphere, and then also what the marketeers call a hero shot of the whole building for the kind of cover of the brochure. So marketing has its own very clear understanding of what they need. But there are also then almost endless other uses to which these versions of these digital images can be put. And actually a lot of them don't have anything to do with atmosphere or indeed marketing. So, for example, the master planners produced a lot of these what are called massing studies early on in the project, which don't contain any of the atmosphere or the figures or anything. They're simply about looking at the volumes of the buildings and figuring out how they work in terms of creating public spaces. So that's massing studies. I'm going to come back to those in a minute. A lot of visualizations in this very crude form, and Google have a 3D visualization package for free called SketchUp, which internally a lot of the architect studios use, just to rough up something really quickly, just to give them a feel for what kind of volume and a mass might look like. And sometimes these very basic visualizations are also kind of pitched informally to the client, just to give them a feel of, well, what would a really tall building look like here? Not exactly this precise building, but just something big here in this corner. What's it going to look like? What do you think? And if the client says, yeah, that's interesting, then I'll go back and start doing something more detailed. Another use of them was they were printed up and put on these fairly large screens in the open air on the building site. And the proposals for the paving and the vegetation were actually, the materials were installed in front of them to see what these choices of different kind of hard landscaping materials would look like. Would they work, given the kind of feel that we're trying to create in this sort of place? And other versions were also drawn up again quite quickly to give to the client to say, look, we've done this design, it's completed, here it is, here's the visualization, could you now release some of the fee that we want? So visualizations exemplify Kress's argument that digital forms of communication are very often tailored to really specific contexts of use. So again, an architect said, I'll target visualizations to presentations to make sure we get the decisions we need. So they're designed to engage with specific actors and to have particular effects. Now, of course, the downside to that, I'm sure it's probably already crossed some of your minds, is that precisely because they're modifiable and different people therefore want different things in them, you can start to find particular occasions when several of the allies of the image actually start to disagree with each other about what should be in the image. So the architects in particular really dislike the marketeer's wish for the hero shot. So an architect told us, he said, we'd be fascinated with the backstreet world. The marketing team wanted the hero shot. The architects also didn't like particularly the kind of really pretty images that they saw that the client was expecting. So one of the master planners said that these images were great for engaging people, but not so useful for design discussion because, and this is a quote, they encourage that they can picture things that lead to inappropriate discussions. So that idea of the client being able to sort of object to things, for the master planner was like a disaster. They slowed things down to keep on having to renegotiate things. And then we had a great discussion with one of the visualisers who was saying to us that they'd spent a lot of time designing a great scene of a kind of big public space, and they've got all the buildings in, and of course they'd showed them to each of the architects, and their immediate reaction was, you can't see enough of our building. You have to change the view and get further back so you can see our building, because our building is the one that's really important to show. So there's all these kind of, because the images are modifiable, everybody wants a stake in them. And to find the agreed final version, I would say, is actually impossible, because then they can constantly be remade to fit different circumstances, different needs, and different requirements. Okay, so that's one particular aspect of these images, where the particular quality of their digitalness, if you like, starts to, I think, rather undermine this glossy surface that they offer, and suggest that actually is rather more problematic than they're often understood to be. Okay, another example of that is, so I've talked about one kind of group of allies of these images, which are the architects and the visualisers who want particular effects from them. Another set of allies, though, are not human allies. They're the other images that these visualisations are designed in relation to. Because this is kind of interesting, one of the many things I think really is interesting in this project is that these visualisations are actually new. I don't know, 10 years ago, we didn't have them. They're a completely new form of image, if you like. And our visualisers and architects kind of struggle, actually, in some ways, to make sense of what kind of images these are. So I was going to show you a video here. Again, I've lost the cursor on the screen, so I can't hit the play button. But when I said earlier that these images are made in large part through visualisation software packages, but once that gets to a certain stage, they're then imported into Photoshop. I'm sure you're familiar with Photoshop. And what happens in Photoshop is that the really complex visual components of these images, which are usually people and things like trees, the really detailed aspects of it, they are cut and pasted, often from online image banks. So photographs of trees and people are cut and pasted into these images in Photoshop to give them their final kind of finished look and finished gloss. So Photoshop is used to add kind of complexity and subtlety to the image. Now, a lot of commentators on the digital image more broadly have suggested that actually this quality of cutting and pasting, of mash up or mix up, is a key characteristic, again, of many forms of digital imagery, not just this particular form of it. And in a recent book by an author, Douillet, I'm not sure how you pronounce that name, he's described this practice as anthological, like an anthology of writing. He's saying that all of digital communication is now anthological because it's about collecting fragments together. The fragment is the basic element of an anthology, and it's the most appropriate form and format of the digital age. An anthology is constituted by assembling various pieces of material under a unifying cover for the use of individual or group brought together by a common interest. And this is exactly what Photoshop does for these images. It brings together bits and pieces and puts them together, and then they're moulded together to create this final version of the image. Now, that's part of their digital nature. But once again, it creates difficulties for this particular project. Because as designed images, I already talked about the importance of these images for a whole series of quite particular agendas. One of the really important agendas is, as I've already said, this project, this design, has to look somehow Qatari and not London or New York or Berlin, or it has to look like it's Qatar. What that means is that you have to have it filled with lots of Qatari-looking people. And unfortunately, because Qatar is rather a small location, the online image banks that these visualisers use, usually to find their people for these visualisations, don't have any images of Qatari individuals. They have quite a lot of Saudi figures, but one of the big issues for this project is not like other big Gulf developments, it has to look Qatari. So our visualisers are going to kind of crazy lengths to try and find figures, people that looked Qatari that they could paste into these images. One of them went onto Flickr and was looking for people's holiday snaps from Doha that he could, I mean, those of you who use Flickr to share your photographs, you may find yourself in a billboard of a city centre one day, because visualisers go into Flickr and they look for somebody who looks Qatari, and they'll cut and paste the image, slice out that figure and stick them into these visualisations. My research associate Claire went to a warehouse in North London that had been rented by one of the London visualisation companies, who had gone to an area of London with a large South Asian, Indian population, and had bought lots of flowing white things from these Indian shops that might look Qatari in a photo shoot. And her handbag also appears in one of these visualisations, because she has one of these big kind of design bags, and that looked like the kind of thing you buy in that kind of street. So her bag and is also one of these more recent visualisations. So, although this kind of flexibility of using the anthological quality of these images is kind of in one sense very creative and participatory, actually it also may have to follow really quite strict expectations of what the image looks like. And maybe, again, the online world is not that open. You can't find everything you want online, and there are problems there as well. And then the final area of which I just want to say very little about really is back to this notion of what kind of images are these? Given that they're quite new, how do people understand and work with them? And again, this is another aspect of these images' alliance with other forms of image. Now, here I'm thinking again about a larger literature about the digital, which talks about how many forms of digital images actually draw very heavily on already existing visual genres that we kind of know how to deal with, if you like. So this is Manovich's idea that a lot of digital images are remediated. Computer games look like Hollywood movies, for example, in large part. Now, the kind of visualisations I've been talking about have, I think, really quite complex relations to an awful lot of other forms of digital and non-pre-digital imagery. Advertising videos, other forms of advertising, and so on. When we were interviewing architects and visualisers, they compared these visualisations to things like printmaking, to collage, to Hollywood special effects, and also to computer games. So I think they were trying to struggle to figure out what images might be. But the sort of image they most frequently compared these visualisations to was photographs. Of course, not surprisingly, this is somebody, visualiser, working on one of the particularly key images that emerged out of all of this, with a photograph on one side that they're going to paste into the image on the other. Photographs are used actually within these visualisations, so in a sense there's a logic, but also the software 3ds Max, the vocabulary that it uses on its menus and its commands and so on, copies the kind of technical language that cameras have. So you set up your camera viewpoint first of all when you decide exactly where and from what view you're going to be designing your image. It has controls for depth of field and for exposure. And a term that is very often used to describe these images is whether they're photorealistic or not. Depth of field, focus exposure and so on are all terms that are used. Now, the visualisers were really quite happy to say that their images are quite like photographs, and they often said that to be a really good visualiser, if you can also take really good architectural photographs, which is a particular genre of photography, you're likely to be a good visualiser as well. But the architects had a very different view in general, and most of them were very reluctant to agree that a visualisation of their design was anywhere near as good as a photograph. One of them said it's not chalk and cheese, but there's definitely the quality in the building which you don't get in the visualisation. And what he actually meant was that the photograph of the building has a kind of quality that visualisations don't have. And in fact, because architects, this only dawned on me quite late in the project because I'm not trained as an architect, but architects aren't actually very interested, at least in the beginning of the design process, in what their building is going to look like, apparently. What they're much more interested in is the volume, the mass, the shape, the flow. They're more interested in the three-dimensional design process that they're doing. And for them, several of them said actually in that case, for them the most realistic image is actually those very abstract white massing study that I showed you earlier, the one that doesn't have any colour or it's just the shapes in plain white. And that for them was more real than these apparently realistic visualisations. So this whole notion of what's real and what's credible in an image is also an area with a lot of discussion and contestation. Okay, so as I said, I've been talking through quite a specific case study, a particular kind of visualisation. And talked about how, in a way though, I think, key aspects of this particular kind of visualisation are actually similar to the way in which many forms of digital images now need to be thought about as mobile, as modifiable, as having various sort of frictions where different elements are being brought together in that kind of anthologising sort of way. So to conclude, I just want to try and bring together some broader reflections then on what this all might mean. I think particularly, I guess I'm coming from a tradition of cultural studies that feels that there's a kind of critical requirement, I guess, in this kind of work. Not to take these images at face value, but to think about them more